Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to Chapter 13, AP World History Modern with Mrs. Hall. Keep in mind, we're going to be doing kind of Chapter 13, 14 combined. So Chapter 13 is kind of Mongols Part 1, where we look at the history of the Mongols, the rise of the Mongols, and the conquering of the Mongols. And then Chapter 14 will be kind of looking at after Genghis Khan's death, what happens to that empire when it fragments into three major empires and then their lasting impact, okay? So Chapter 13 is kind of Part 1, the rise and unification of the Mongols, takeover of the Mongols under Genghis Khan. And then Chapter 14 will be kind of Part 2, all right? So let's dive in. As always, it will be helpful if you have the PowerPoints, if you're able to print it. Otherwise, taking notes, you can condense it down. And then I would have your chapter questions. And again, you might be able to answer some of them as we go along. But remember, you're still responsible to answer them outside of the lecture. The lecture is not guarantee all of them, okay? But I will go over some of them in the lecture. So helpful to have them, and then you can always pause and kind of answer and go through some of them and then finish answering them after the lecture, okay? This is always one of my favorite chapters. Who doesn't love the Mongols? Okay, they're savage, they're crazy, they're merciless, and some of the most scandalous people in history are the funnest to talk about. Now, maybe not fun to live during their time, believe me, I'm not saying I'd want to live under Genghis Khan, but he is somebody really fascinating to talk about, and students tend to really enjoy it. All right, so let's jump in. Date range for this chapter would be 1200 to 1500, okay? Geographic location, they're going to start in what is present-day Mongolia, so that's East Asia. They are then going to conquer China, and they're going to spread along the Silk Road, okay? So really, we're going to have East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually, they will even conquer Russia, all right? And those will be tributaries from afar. So you really have four locations. You have East Asia, which will be China. You have Central Asia that they'll conquer, and the Middle East, and then they eventually will make it all the way to what is present-day Russia, all right? So I would even put Russia on there. For key civilizations, we have obviously the Mongols, all right? And then we have the different subgroups that they're going to break up into, okay? So we have the Yuan, the Golden Horde, and the Ilkhan. So Yuan, Golden Horde, and Ilkhan, all right, that they will break up to. So they are the Mongols while Genghis Khan is alive, and then once Genghis Khan dies, they will break up into three different kind of cohorts or three different kind of subgroups, all Mongols, but no longer unified under one rule when Genghis Khan dies. Because we all want to know when the leader dies, when Alexander the Great dies, if it's a religious leader, or if it's a spiritual leader, whatever it is, or an empire leader, everybody wants to know who is next. And often it creates division and competition, and Genghis Khan is no different. All right, so let's jump in. Okay, so let's talk about the rise of Genghis Khan, okay? Before he was known as Genghis Khan, his name was Temujin, all right, which actually meant blacksmith. It's believed that he was born around 1162, died around 1227, all right? And a little bit about him. So the Mongols were a nomadic tribe, okay, again, living in Central Asia in the Mongol steppes, okay, so what is present-day like Mongolia, okay, so kind of northwest of present-day China. So they would have traded with the Chinese, they would have been familiar with the Chinese, but these would have been, remember when I talked about how China had this attitude that they were the center of the world, they were better than everyone, and everyone else was a barbarian? This would have been an example of one of the barbaric groups, or probably one of the main barbaric groups that the Chinese would have had contact with, okay? So they traded with the Chinese probably, but this was a nomadic group. The Mongol steppes are extremely arid, dry, there's a lack of trees, it's very open, it's extremely cold, and so you have to move about. In fact, they lack firewood, so they would actually burn their horse dung. So they would take the horse turds, let them dry up, and then they would burn them, and that was one of their main fuel sources. So literally when the Mongols got the reputation for being stinky barbarians, that wasn't actually all that far off, because they were stinky because they literally smelled like horse crap. There was no way around it, okay? So the Mongols, before they became unified, were a cultural group, but they were not politically unified. They were a series of tribes, okay? So each tribe had their own Khan, which was the leader of their tribe, okay? So the story goes is that Temujin, when he was a child, his father was the leader of their tribe, okay? And the story goes that when Temujin was young, his father was out on some campaign with his, fellow men and soldiers, and they had successfully won in battle against some rival Mongol tribe or some rival nomadic group, and they were riding on their way back to their tribe. Well, they had stopped for the night, and they had come in contact with this other small group. So basically, these two groups decided to share the campfire for the night. It's cold, and, you know, hey, we're going to be good neighbors and share the campfire. Well, the story goes is that when Temujin's father and these men came upon this group with the campfire, that the men at this campfire recognized his dad and were like, hey, that's the guy, that's the tribe that attacked our tribe a couple years earlier and killed a whole bunch of our guys. All right? So Temujin's dad didn't recognize them, didn't realize that this was some guys that he had attacked a few years earlier and that they had survived. All right? So they're like, oh, yeah, sure, you can come share our fire. You can come hang out with us for the night. And when they did, these guys basically assassinated him. They poisoned his meal and they killed him. And then after they killed him and his men, they went and attacked Temujin's tribe. Now that they had just killed his dad and all their warriors, came and attacked what was left of his tribe. Now, Temujin was a young boy. They estimate maybe 7 or 8 years old, you know, so not even close to manhood yet. He had a couple older siblings, had an older brother, older sister, we believe his mom, but he's not ready to take over yet. So when his tribe is attacked, they are basically left defenseless. They're defenseless, okay? And a lot of their people were killed, and those who weren't killed were enslaved. So the question becomes, what do you do with the family of the leader of the dead Khan? Do you keep them alive? Well, the answer, of course, is no, okay? You can't keep those kids alive. Now, I know you're like, Miss Hall, you're sounding really barbaric. Why can't you keep them alive? Think about practically why that's not okay. He's a kid now, but what's he going to grow up to be? An angry adult, right, who's mad at you for killing his dad. So you got to get rid of the kids, because someday those kids are going to grow up with a vendetta to take over, right? Now, in their culture, it was considered barbaric to like actually kill the family of the Khan. So what they would do is they would basically leave you for dead, which was like a death sentence. So they abandoned Genghis Khan or Temujin's mother, his brother, his sister, and him, and left them with nothing on the Mongol steppes to freeze to death and starve to death. I mean, this was a death sentence. His brother died, his sister died, and his mother literally starved to death on the steppes. Temujin was the last one that was still surviving, literally was on his deathbed when a rival tribe came across him, literally on his deathbed, saw an opportunity, took him in, and raised him as a slave. So the story goes is that basically he was left for dead, and by luck, or some would say the gods, that he was taken in by this rival tribe. So when he was taken in by this rival tribe, he's raised as a slave. Now, he was a fiery young man, you know, who obviously is searching for his cause. He's searching for meaning. And the men of this tribe that he was taken in by and treated as a slave kind of took pity on him and kind of liked his fiery spirit and actually taught him how to fight when he wasn't serving them as a slave boy. And he actually became a pretty good young fighter. And eventually, he was such a good fighter that they incorporated him into their military. That he kind of went from being a slave to being a part of their actual military. In fact, he was so good that he became eventually, by his late teens, the leader of this tribe's military. And in fact, at one point, he became so good that he killed the Khan of the tribe and took over as Khan. So the very tribe that took him in as a slave, that found him when he was basically dead, when he was left for dead by his original tribe, who had been conquered, right? Taken in as a slave, trained by happen chance to fight, rises up and is such a fierce fighter that eventually he becomes their lead warrior, defeats the Khan of that tribe, and takes over as Khan. And then sets out on his life mission, which is to take over one tribe at a time, at a time, at a time. By 1206, he is unified all the major Mongol tribes together, and he is declared the Great Khan. So this is where he loses the name Temujin, all right, and he becomes known as Genghis Khan, the Great Khan, all right? So no longer just a Khan, but the Great Khan, all right, which Khan means sent by God. And so in a similar kind of way, we see this connection between secular leadership and we see religious leadership, right, where it's connected to one another. And in their culture, you prove yourself through battle. How do you know that the gods favor you or want you to be their leader? Through favor in battle. If you continue to win and you live, the gods must favor you. If you die, your favor was over. So it's a loose kind of way of mandate of heaven, in that you are backed by the gods. Here's what this man was all about. He was about conquering. From 1206 to 1405, the Mongol Empire is the largest land empire the world has ever seen. It's going to stretch all the way from present-day Korea to Hungary, to present-day Baghdad, all the way to the Middle East to Eastern Europe. Okay? The only empire that physically, land-wise, will be larger than that is present-day Russia. Literally, this is the largest land empire the world had ever seen. And it's not just that it's the largest empire, largest land empire the world had ever seen, but it's done by a bunch of barbaric men who were they were not a large empire. They didn't have a lot of men. Most of the time when they fought battles, they were outnumbered 4-1, 5-1. These were savage fighters though, and their discipline in fighting is going to set them apart. This is what makes them so memorable. I mean, look at this. Okay, so they start in Mongolia. When they first go down, they're going to conquer China, and then they're going to use the Silk Road going west as their guide for conquering. So keep this map in mind. This could definitely pop up on your test, okay? By the time Genghis Khan dies, okay, he has conquered most of Eastern Asia and Central Asia, and then after his death, it continues really into the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and they're basically stopped in Eastern Europe or the fringes of Russia, okay? But literally, they conquer all of Asia, and except for South Asia, right? Southeast Asia. But they even go into the fringes of Southeast Asia. I mean, it is amazing what they did. And this is before this is before automobiles, before airplanes, this is before railroads, it's before any kind of mechanized travel. This is all just through savage fighting and reputation and tributaries. All right, they built a reputation. This is why such a small barbaric group is one of the most well-known people in history that we talk about. Okay, this statement really says it all. What was Genghis Khan all about? All right, here was his value statement. Here's what he was all about. Here was his motto. The greatest joy a man can know is to conquer his enemies and drive them before him. To drive his horses and take away their possessions. To see the faces of those who are dear to them bedewed with tears, and to clasp their wives and daughters in their arms. Isn't this sick? This is the greatest joy a man can know, is to conquer his enemy and to drive him before him. This is basically what he's saying. The greatest joy that I can ever know is to see my enemy on his face in the ground, hugging his wife and his daughter, begging for mercy as his wife and daughter are taken from him, and watch them raped and killed right in front of him, and watch him scream for mercy, and I'm going to sit there and laugh in his face, and he's going to watch his wife and daughter killed, and then I'm going to kill him. This is the greatest joy a man can know. Genghis Khan was a ruthless man. He is probably one of the most ruthless conquerors in history. People like Hitler, like Stalin, like Mao, guess who they strived to be like? Guess who their heroes were when they wanted to study, what do I want to be like? Genghis Khan. He's like the OG of I want to be a bad ruler. Genghis Khan. This really is a man who set out with a vengeance and had one focus and one goal. Now, think about this. Was he born this way, or was this fostered in him? What in his past do you think created this? Well, look at what happened to him. He watched his mother. He was left for dead. Can you imagine being 8 years old and finding out your dad was poisoned, watching your whole village burned and killed, and then having your mother and your brother and your sister left for dead, and watching them slowly die and starve to death? Can you imagine the psychological damage, the mental damage that would do? You were left for dead. You're on the verge of death, and then you're taken in and you're raised as a slave. Now imagine then living in slavery and what that must have been like, and the abuses he must have faced, and how tough he must have to have been, and then learning to fight. And he probably started killing people in his early teenage years, and what that must have been like. I mean, so it's not that I'm excusing this, but is it any wonder? Look at the trauma he experienced, and then what he had to do to survive. Is it any wonder that he becomes like this? Is it any wonder that he becomes like this? It's not surprising. So one of the major things that sets the Mongols apart is actually their horses. So let's spend a second talking about their horses. Their horses are really cool, okay? They take a survival of the fittest approach, not only with their people, but with their horses. So with their people, what they would do, they were nomads. So they did not stay in one place. They would move around from place to place. And so what they would do is the warriors would travel ahead, and then the women and children and elderly would travel behind them and catch up, kind of. So the warriors would go ahead and fight as the women and children would kind of meet up with them, all right? But they were always kind of like, closely behind them. And stuff. But if you were elderly, if you got to a point where you couldn't keep up with them, if you became injured or something like that, if you couldn't keep up, you were basically left for dead. They really did have a survival of the fittest mentality. Not as barbaric as the Spartans, but that was their lifestyle was so rough that you didn't tend to survive if you were weak. There was no place for the weak. Okay, everyone carried their own weight. So in the same way with their horses. So here's what they did with their horses. You wouldn't even consider them horses. They were more like ponies. They were so short. And what they would do is their ponies were actually fairly short and robust. You would kind of look at them and you might even go, golly, that little pony maybe is a little on the plump side, the round side. But here's what they would do with their ponies that was really cool. And the video you're going to watch, the Mankind video, will talk about this as well. They didn't have the ability to water their horses all the time and feed their horse all the time. So they took the same approach with their ponies. Literally, their ponies could survive in the harshest terrain. There could be sub-to-zero temperatures with no shelter, and these ponies could survive. So literally every day or every night, they would let their horses go, and the horses had to fend for themselves, had to find their own water, their own food, and survive. And if the horses died, then they died. Only the best horses survived. Therefore, only the best horses reproduced. So this created a very hardy line of horses. In fact, these horses were so cool. These horses could travel sometimes up to 100 to 200 miles a day. Okay, so each Mongol would have like 2 or 3 horses, and every 50 to 75 miles they would switch out horses. So they would constantly ride, and they would just switch out horses. But these horses were so well trained and so hardy, they could just keep going and going and going. So this is what made them so savage, that before you even knew that they were coming, they were there. So you'd have scouts watching for them, and you had no time to report back to your people that you were going to be invaded because they were upon you. They would move so fast. So this is how they were able to beat so many people, because of their ability to move. So they took very much a survival of the fittest approach, natural selection, so only the best horses would survive. Now their battle tactics were no different, okay? There were 3 options. I would write this down. 3 options when the Mongols are coming. So write this down. First option, okay? I'm going to fight. That means everyone's going to die. If you decide to resist the Mongols, they will win and they will kill everyone. Let me repeat that. Everyone. Every man, every woman, and every child. And then let me get really detailed here for a minute, because this is where the Mongols really get their reputation. Before they would kill the women, they would rape them. They were savage. They were not honorable warriors, okay? They raped and pillaged like you wouldn't believe. They would burn people alive. They would gang rape. They did savage, terrible things. They would set people on fire. I mean, they did horrible things. If you've ever heard of biological warfare, you're going to see in the video, guess who started it? The Mongols. They would take disease-ridden bodies and launch them over buildings, launch them over walls to disease-ridden the whole town. They played dirty. They didn't care. They'd poison water. They didn't care. So your first option, fight them. Everyone dies, and it's a long, painful death. Second option, oh, we'll just close up our city and wait them out. Oh, they love that. They love that. They're like, okay, we'll poison the water. We'll cut off the food supply. We'll wait for 3 or 4 weeks while you starve to death, and when you come out and you beg for mercy, go back to option 1. We'll kill the men, we'll rape the women, we'll burn the children alive. So if you resist them, everyone dies. If you resist them and wait them out, everyone dies. Third option, you give in right away. You become a tributary. Then guess what? They were actually merciful. They would say, okay, cool. The Mongols had a lot of tributaries. They did not have enough people to directly rule. So here's what they did. By being so savage, and I'm not excusing their behavior, but it did work in the sense that how were they able to build such a massive empire? By being so savage, their reputation would precede them, and people would be like, oh my gosh, these Mongols, you just got to give in. A lot of people would give in. So literally when they would pull up, you would open up those gates, and it was Thanksgiving Day. You're like, welcome. You would pull out the fine china. You would treat them awesome. Make them feel welcome. And the Mongols would be like, okay, cool. And they would let you live. And most of the time, They really didn't change much. Because the Mongols were nomadic, they lacked culture. So the one thing that they were good at was fighting, nothing else. So they actually tended to adopt people's language, people's religion, people's practices. So if you became a tributary of theirs, they were actually very tolerant rulers as far as whatever your practices were. They didn't force you to change a lot of your practices. So as long as you were willing to politically submit to them, life actually didn't really change that much. So a lot of people just submitted to them, one, so they didn't die, and two, because the Mongols, because they lacked culture, because they were nomadic, moving around and such fighters, they lacked culture and actually wanted to culturally diffuse you. Make sure that you put that down. I cannot emphasize that enough. Okay, so here were their battle tactics. Once, okay, they started riding from the age of 2 or 3. So they were excellent fighters, excellent riders, okay? They traveled very light. Like I said, they could ride sometimes upward of, several hundred miles in one day, okay? Excellent endurance, okay? They were ruthless in their battle tactics. Literally, everyone died. Raping, pillaging, setting people on fire, biological warfare, okay? Their horse abilities, they could attack from on their horses, bow and arrow attack on their horses, crossbows. They were absolutely amazing, and there really were only 3 outcomes. So a lot of people gave in before they ever even, a lot of people, they didn't even have to fight. So when they did fight, they were often outnumbered, but they were so swift and they were so savage that they would win. It's kind of like being ambushed, that the element of surprise, even if you're outnumbered, by catching them by surprise, it would allow them that advantage. They would coordinate, and then what they would do is people that would become tributaries there, people that chose option 3, which was the smart option, they would incorporate those people into their army. So this is how they were able to build their army much larger. And like I said, they could move upward of 100 miles a day, which is just absolutely amazing. And then they would use this battle tactic called what Hitler actually loved the Mongols, and he studied their battle tactics, and Hitler's going to use a concept called blitzkrieg, which was the concept of you hit them with everything at once. So Hitler in World War II, he's going to hit you with his tanks and the airplanes and air invasion and artillery shell, everything at once, so that it causes chaos. So the Mongols would do the same thing. They would hit you with horses and shells and catapults. They would do everything at once to cause chaos. And so Hitler is going to use that similar kind of tactic. But like I said, if you gave in to them, if you gave in to Mongol rule, okay, if you gave in to Mongol rule, they actually were very tolerant rulers who actually tended to convert or give in to your way of doing things, okay? So as long as you paid tribute, they actually, because they lacked culture, would adopt your way of doing things. Now, they practiced something called tax farming, so let's talk about that really quick. Tax farming was a system where they would lease out the collection of taxes. So basically, where a private organization would collect the taxes, okay? And the problem with tax farming was that when the private organization would come to collect taxes, so let's say that you were hired by the Mongol government to go collect taxes, this private organization, and it was agreed upon that you would collect $50 per person. Let's just say that was the tax fee for that year, okay? The problem is because it was privatized, you, the private person, you just owe the government $50 a person. So as long as you deliver that, they don't care what you do. And so tax farming, what would happen is that private organization would go door to door and collect taxes, but they often would collect over that. So let's say they would collect $75 per person. They would collect over that. They would pocket the $25 and hand over $50 to the Mongols. So they would overtax. So tax farming is the privatization of collecting taxes, but it leads to overtaxation because there's no oversight by the government. So the Mongols practiced this, and so it did hurt a lot of people. Let's look at question number 1 really quick. It says, on his deathbed, Genghis Khan reportedly announced, if you want to retain your possessions and conquer your enemies, you must make your subjects submit willingly and unite your diverse energies into a single end. Explain how this principle was applied in the expansion of the Mongol Empire. Well, you kind of see it in 3 different ways, okay? And I know that this contradicts his first principle, but this is kind of a later in life tactic where it's like he was extreme in 2 senses, in that if you resisted him, it was death, but if you gave in, he was actually fairly reasonable, okay? So they did this. How was this principle applied? Well, their battle tactics, right? they created such a reputation for themselves through their swift horses, through their bow and arrows, through their bow and arrows would actually, they were so efficient with their bow and arrows, they actually went about a third the distance longer than their competitors. So let's say that the average bow and arrow went 100 yards, theirs would go 125 yards. So if you were in a field across from one another, you were the enemy and you're like, oh, they're drawing their bow and arrows, they're not going to hit us. You didn't know that the Mongol bow and arrows actually go further, and they could take you out before you could ever hit them. So their military tactics is one of the things that helped them. Second was the Silk Road. They were motivated by expansion, trade. So trade was they wanted to control the trade routes and all the empires and economies that were along the trade route. So that was their major motivation. So they conquered China first and then expanded along the Silk Road. And then third, if they did conquer you, or if you did get it, by being tolerant. So people, once they were a tributary of the Mongols, there really was no reason to rebel against them, because the alternative was death. So it's kind of like, well, if they're fairly reasonable while they're conquering us, why would we rebel? They culturally diffused. Because they lacked culture, right, because of their nomadic roots, they tended to adopt your religion, your language, which tends to be the things that people are most defensive about. So it kind of takes away reasons to rebel. The SAQ is asking you, right, about their technologies and their advancements. So that's some things that we talked about. So look at horses, stirrups, gunpowder, catapults, that cultural, their reputation, crossbow, that cultural attitude, things like that. Okay, the Pax Mongolica, let's talk about this really quick. Okay, so the Pax Mongolica, think of like the Roman piece, but this is the Mongol piece. So this is the period where they were at their height. So this is the period in the 13th century, so the 1200s, where literally they control from China all the way to the Middle East. Literally, the Silk Road was controlled by one empire. This is the first time in history. So the Silk Road becomes like a super highway of trade, and it's absolutely phenomenal. All right, it's a very peaceful period where all this ideas coming from the East, all this ideas of the Song dynasty that we talked about in chapter 11 and 12, okay, are now flowing down the Silk Road. So like gunpowder, printing press, compass, sails, all these different technologies are now being traded down the Silk Road, because the Mongols, they cared about conquering because they cared about trade. Economics was their #1 focus in the expansion of their empire, and controlling the Silk Road meant that there was no competition. Trade became very, very peaceful. They actually developed a passport system so that people could move freely up and down the Silk Road. And like I said, technology, gunpowder, diplomatic passports, all these things will transfer from East Asia all the way through the Middle East, all the way to Asia. So by the time, if you look at the timing of their conquering of the Silk Road in the 1200s, that's at the same time that the Crusades are coming to an end. So just as you have to look at, everything is cause, effect, and connection. So just as the Mongols are rising and controlling the Silk Road and bringing all this technology down the Silk Road from Asia, guess who now is reinstating trade in the West? Western Europe. And now guess who now is getting all the gunpowder, printing press, compass, and these kind of things? Europe. And Europe is going to use these technologies to start a rebirth, which we will call the Renaissance, that we will start in chapter 14 and 15. Okay, let's talk about the expansion of the Mongols real quick. So their expansion was motivated by trade. I can't emphasize that enough. And their expansion, iron was important to them. Wood, cotton, silk, like I said, gunpowder, printing press, all these different technologies. They were really motivated by trade and controlling trade. And so the byproduct of that is all these technologies and goods moving from the East, advancements of the East, going to the Middle East, through Mediterranean Sea trade to Western Europe, okay? And that rebirth, that Western Europe coming out of the Dark Ages that the Crusades connected, are going to realize these things. Now, with every positive, there are also negatives. And one of the negatives is going to be disease, all right? And you will also see about this in one of the Mankind Plague videos, okay? Is that one of the worst pandemics, epidemics, whatever you want to call it, literally is going to be spread by the Mongols. I call it the gift that keeps on giving, okay? It is literally going to kill half of Eurasia. Half of Eurasia's population is going to be spread by the bubonic plague, or sometimes known as the Black Plague, which will start in East Asia, will spread along the Silk Road, and will end up in Western Europe. Now, in some areas it will only kill around 25%, some areas upward of 75%. So if you take the average, what is the average that the Black Death is going to kill? We estimate roughly about 50%. And this is by fleas that will be carried on rats that will get on the carts through trade and then will infiltrate into all these caravan towns and town to town to town. So it's something that takes a week or so to get infected. So by the time you have it, you don't even know it, and then it's already spread, and you don't have a chance to really stop it. The religious practices of the Mongols, again, they believed in a sky god, but they were very, very flexible in their religious beliefs. And so they tended, again, to culturally diffuse with whoever they were. So when they conquered China, they're going to practice Buddhism and Confucianism. When they conquer the Middle East, they're going to convert to Islam. When they conquer in other areas, they will convert to local religions, okay? When they move into South Asia, they will convert to Hinduism and to Islam. So they have their original beliefs, but we will see them culturally diffuse over time quite a bit. Many arranged marriages, and women, again, their treatment of women were terrible, and they were known especially for the raping and pillaging of women all throughout their rule, unfortunately. Okay, positive qualities of the Mongols. Well, they were very disciplined when it came to fighting, okay? They took it very seriously. They were about their code of conduct when it came to fighting. They were very undisciplined when it came to their treatment of women and other types of society, but they were about loyalty and respect for their leaders. Loyalty and respect. When you were a tributary, if you had an agreement with them, they were about respect for that opponent. But if you violated that, then all respect was gone. So as long as you upheld an agreement with them, they maintained respect. They honored the code or the agreement that you had. But if you violated that, you just made a deal with the devil, so to speak. You know what I mean? And you would pay the consequences. Now, Mongol women did have higher status, but women that they conquered, not so much. So this was kind of a double-edged sword. So after Genghis Khan's death, what happened? So everybody always wants to know, like, when the leader dies, what happens? And unfortunately, when the leader dies, what they build usually falls apart. Culturally speaking, the Mongols will continue, but after Genghis Khan's death, what happens is that it branches into 3 major empires. Technically 4, but you only need to know 3, okay? So write these down, know these, and this is what chapter 14 is really going to focus on. So we'll touch on it a little bit this chapter, and then chapter 14, we're really going to focus in on these 3 major subgroups, okay? So after Genghis Khan's death, all right, it'll really break up into 3 major groups. So there will be the Yuan dynasty, which will be China, which is Mongol rule of China, which for the Chinese, this is like hell is frozen over, the worst thing that could ever happen to them, okay? Then there's going to be the Golden Horde, which is, the Golden Horde was more in like present-day Turkey, so kind of the northern Middle East, and Russia will be a tributary of theirs. So Russia will be like their major tributary. And then we will have the Ilkhan, which is like present-day Iran, so kind of central Middle East, fringes of like Iran, Pakistan, that will rule. So the Golden Horde and the Ilkhan will be Muslim, and the Yuan dynasty or empire, they will be Buddhist Confucius. All right. So upon Genghis Khan's death, over the course of like 25 to 50 years, we will see the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into these sub-empires, and you need to know the major 3. So what kind of effects is Mongol rule going to have on Russia? Well, let's talk about that a little bit, okay? Let's talk about that a little bit. So Mongol rule in Russia. So the Mongols, like I said, the Mongols, when they're ruled afar by Russia, we're talking about the Golden Horde, okay? So in this response, make sure you're talking about the Golden Horde, okay? And they are going to be like in what is present day, like Turkey, present-day Turkey, Syria, that northern part of the Middle East, just south of the Black Sea, all right? And Russia will be a tributary there. So when we say rule from afar, we mean tributary, okay? And the main reason they kept Russia was because they wanted them for taxes, all right? Now, when they ruled them from afar, Moscow is going to become the meeting place. So what would happen is a couple times a year, okay, the Golden Horde Mongol representatives would travel to Moscow, and then the Russian princes, so before it was actually Russia, it was a series of little city-states, okay, or little smaller Russian princes would come together and meet the Mongol rulers there, and they would basically conduct business, aka they would basically come together and they would pay their tribute. All right. Now, here's an example again of where the Mongols were very tolerant. They did not care that Russia was a different religion. The dominant religion in Russia was Christianity. Now, it was not the Catholic Church like Western Europe. It was Greek Orthodoxy. Russia wanted to be like the Greeks, and the Greeks were going to be a part of the Byzantine Empire, all right, which was Greek Orthodox Church. So even though the Golden Horde was Islamic, they allowed the Russians to continue to be Christian Orthodox, all right? So they granted them special privilege in that they could carry on their cultural practices, their day-to-day practice, as long as they paid their taxes and tribute. That's all they cared about. But the impact that they're going to have is that they are going to cut off Russia from the rest of Western Europe. So Russia literally is going to be culturally cut off, and their only outside contact they're going to have is with the Mongols in the Middle East. So what's really interesting is that Russia will continue to practice Christian Orthodoxy, yet culturally they are going to act more like the Middle East. Their buildings will have more domes, which look more like mosques in the Middle East. Their men will wear robes and long beards. Their women will have head coverings and be more secluded, which is more culturally like people of the Middle East. They will culturally be cut off from Western Europe, even though Moscow and that part of Russia is technically a part of Europe. So the impact of Mongol rule in Russia is that, one, Russia's allowed to keep Christian Orthodoxy, but two, that it becomes isolated from the rest of Europe. And this is important later on because Russia's going to get the nickname, at least this is what I nickname, as the rejects of Europe. And this is where it starts, because when Europe is going through its rebirth, the Renaissance and the rebirth and this huge time of exploration and stuff, guess who's not a part of that rebirth? Guess who's absent from that party? Guess who's cut off? Russia, because they are tributaries of Mongols. Okay, it's like they're in the dark. Okay, they are part of Europe, yet they are not a part of Europe. So when they join Europe later, they are behind the times. It would be kind of like you are in high school, or it would be like you are 15 years old, but I just put you in 8th grade. And you would feel very out of place. And that's what's really going to happen to Russia. So the isolation is that they culturally are going to act more like Mongols in the Middle East than they are actual Europeans because of that isolation that they're going to go through. Also during this time, this is the time of Marco Polo. Okay, Marco Polo was an explorer. If you've ever played that game in the pool, Marco Polo, Marco Polo. You ever play that game, you know, in the pool? You're like, why would we play that game? Okay, I remember wondering that growing up. I didn't learn about that really till college, who Marco Polo was. Well, here you go. Marco Polo was an Italian merchant, okay, who wanted to know where all these great resources were coming from and will make his way along the Silk Road. Now, most people who tried to travel to Asia died of different things. They were killed, they died of disease, they died of old age. There were a lot of things in warfare. I mean, there were a lot of things that could happen or reasons that you would die, okay, and they wouldn't live through it. Marco Polo made it to China, and he actually is going to make it to China during the Yuan dynasty, which was Mongol rule of China. Now, if he had made it during an actual Chinese dynasty, Chinese-led dynasty, he wouldn't have been welcome. They would have been like, thank you, come again. But the Mongols were all about it. They were like, hey, come on, welcome. So he actually is going to hang out with the Mongols, the Yuan dynasties, Kublai Khan, who was a descendant of Genghis Khan, for quite a few years, actually. And he's going to learn about black powder, like gunpowder. He's going to learn about noodles. He's going to learn about all kinds of cool things. What is Italy known for? Pasta, right? Guess where they got the idea? China. How cool is that? And he is going to travel back through Indian Ocean trade and make his way back to Italy. So part of that rebirth and exposing of Italy and Europe to East Asia and what was so cool about them and sparking some of the curiosity of Europe in what East Asia had to offer was from Marco Polo. We're going to talk more about him. What's funny is that when Marco Polo first got back to Italy from East Asia. They actually threw him in prison because they thought they were like, first they were like, who are you? Because he'd been gone for like 25 years. So they thought he was like a traitor, okay? And he had to convince them like, no, no, no. And they had to like show him his diaries from like 20 years of hanging out with Kublai Khan. Like, no, look at all the cool stuff I have. And then the book that he's going to write, The Travels of Marco Polo, second only to the Bible, is going to be like the bestseller of the entire Renaissance, okay? And will actually spark or increase the curiosity of the exploration age, where people like read about this and it was like an adventure book. People were like, wow, I want to go to East Asia. I want to go see these cool things, because he actually got to hang out. So it was cool timing of when he visited Asia, because if he had been there during Chinese rule, they never would have let him in. They were not welcoming to foreigners. Where the Mongols, as long as you were nice, were actually very cool. And he got to hang out in the inner circle with the top Khan of the Yuan dynasty, which is really cool. So he is like hanging out, you know, with the Khan of the Yuan dynasty. So the point of this chapter is to understand the roots of the Mongols, how they expanded, the massive impact that they're going to have over time, and then upon Genghis Khan's death, right, that it will fragment, okay? But because of the cultural unity, the trade along the Silk Road will continue. So Genghis Khan unites the Mongols and builds this massive Eurasia empire, then dies. And then it's fragmented into 3 major parts, but the trade will still continue. So even though it fragments into the Yuan, the Golden Horde, so you'll see the Golden Horde here, like Turkey, Black Sea area. You see the Ilkhan here, like present-day Iran, Pakistan. And so even though it fragments, that trade will still continue, and all these ideas and disease, unfortunately, like gunpowder and the compass and all these awesome things, gunpowder, compass, and printing press, that will be the backbone of the Renaissance and exploration age, and unfortunately the Black Death as well, which will wipe out half of Eurasia, will all be because of the Mongols. This is why we give the Mongols so much emphasis. Such a small barbaric group gets so much acknowledgement. They're a savage group who makes a huge impact and builds the largest land empire the world has ever seen, other than the Russians, with no railroad, no airplanes, no modern technology. It's really amazing. And then in chapter 14, we're going to go into more details and impact about that. Okay? Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.